There's a mysterious curve in life that few people recognize. One not drawn on maps, skipped in school lessons, absent from family conversations. It doesn't come with warning signs or party invitations. Yet one day, around the age of 60, it arrives quietly, unannounced, and everything within starts to shift. Outwardly, life might seem unchanged. The pace slows, daily routines grow gentler, emotions settle into a softer rhythm. But beneath this calm exterior, something profound begins to stir. A subtle internal axis tilts. The soul, once marching forward in the pursuit of identity and achievement, starts to turn, not backward, but inward. It begins to yearn for something long buried beneath decades of striving. This isn't a midlife crisis. It's not a breakdown or a flashy reinvention. It's more like a quiet realignment, an internal softening, a peeling away of layers built for survival. Suddenly, the ambitions that once seemed vital lose their edge. The hunger for validation, the urgency to impress, the drive to build or conquer, they all begin to fade. These long-held pursuits no longer hold meaning, not because they were wrong, but because they were never the soul's final destination. Now, the soul wants something else, truth. The shift is subtle, yet undeniable. It shows up in the strangest ways. One day you might wake up and realize you no longer care about the latest trends. Conversations that once excited you now feel draining. The image you built so carefully over the years starts to feel like a costume. Something inside says, enough. And that something is your soul. Carl Jung spoke of this moment. He said the first half of life is for building the ego, developing structure, achieving status, finding your place in society. But the second half, that belongs to the soul. And the soul has no interest in performance. It seeks what is real. And realness begins with stillness, with listening to what you've silenced for years. At 60, the soul starts returning to places you abandoned. It searches through the rubble of your past, looking for what was lost in the noise. Dreams set aside, emotions repressed, parts of you that never got to live. And it doesn't do this to bring pain. It does this to reconnect you with what's essential. Because the soul understands something most of us forget. The things we pushed away in order to survive were never meant to be erased. They were meant to wait, and now they are no longer willing to be quiet. They come in flashes of memory, in sudden tears, in unexpected longings. They ask not for regret, but for attention, not for grief, but for integration. Many describe this phase of life as strange, as if they're drifting from a life they once cared so deeply about. Even with stability, steady jobs, grown children, a paid-off house, there's an odd emptiness, not of lack, but of clarity. A whisper begins to echo inside. This isn't depression. This is truth. It's time to stop looking outward for what was always inside. This moment marks the beginning of a return, not a retreat from life, but a re-entry into the soul's deeper path. You begin to ask different questions. Instead of, what can I achieve? Then you ask, what really matters now? Instead of, who should I be? You wonder, who am I beneath everything I've been told? And these questions are not born of confusion, but awakening. This awakening doesn't arrive with fireworks or dramatic gestures. It begins in silence, in moments of stillness when you no longer feel the need to fill every hour. When the quiet becomes a companion instead of something to avoid. You start to see your life like a room that's finally been emptied of clutter. And now you're able to walk around and notice what's been buried under the noise. At 60, the soul begins to demand something new. Not material possessions, not accolades, but wholeness. It no longer seeks another title, a newer car, a tighter body. It yearns for peace. It searches for meaning in simple things. The warmth of morning light on your face, the weight of a long hug, the quiet joy of a deep breath taken without urgency. The soul, having spent decades in the shadows of ambition, now takes the lead and whispers, "Return to what matters." There's a deep inner cleansing that begins, not always visible to others, but deeply felt within. You start to open the drawers of your inner life, the ones you've kept locked and hidden. Inside are old fears you inherited, but never questioned. There are moments you never forgave, people you never truly released. And now, the soul invites you to look, really look, without judgment, without flinching. It asks you to discard what's no longer true, to forgive those who never knew how to love you properly, to let go of the exhausting need to be strong all the time. You begin to face the mirror with fewer defenses. The layers come off: makeup, pride, expectations, shame. And for the first time in perhaps decades, you see yourself as you truly are. Not as a role, not as a projection, but as a being. And it is in that vulnerable seeing that healing begins. Not a fixing of what's broken, but a reuniting with what was always whole beneath the scars. Those who walk into this phase with open eyes and an honest heart discover something extraordinary. The soul does not age. The body may slow, but the soul doesn't fade. It sharpens, it reclaims, it blossoms. And what once felt like the end of something begins to reveal itself as a beginning. A new chapter not of doing, but of being. Not of proving, but of living deeply, truthfully, and fully. This is the hidden secret, the curve no one warned you about. But if you listen closely, you'll notice it's been calling for years. You were just too busy surviving to hear it. Now, the voice grows louder. The invitation becomes clearer. To come home to yourself. Some call this stage maturity, others call it aging. But those words fall short of what this really is. It is a sacred transformation, a rerouting in what is timeless. In this sacred transformation, there is a sense of acceleration, not in the physical world, but in the soul. While your body might ask for more rest, your spirit seems to awaken with a new urgency. Not the frantic kind that pushed you through your career or family obligations, but a quiet inner insistence that says, now is the time. Time no longer feels abundant in quantity, so you begin to measure it in quality. Each moment matters more. Each conversation, each choice, each glance carries deeper weight. The soul begins to question everything you once accepted without hesitation. Certain clothes no longer feel like you. Certain people no longer fit. The things that once made you proud now feel like burdens. You wonder, who am I when I'm not performing? What part of me has been untouched by other people's expectations? What would I choose if I didn't have to please anyone? These questions aren't random. They're seeds of your next season. They sprout from the soul's insistence that your remaining years not be wasted in roles that suffocate or scripts written by others. This new chapter is not about rebellion. It's about reclamation. You begin to retrieve parts of yourself that were tucked away in exchange for belonging, success, or safety. Carl Jung believed that after a life of adaptation and striving, the psyche turns toward reintegration, that the shadow, the parts of you that didn't get a voice, starts to ask for space. And here's the beautiful paradox. The shadow isn't something to fear. It's not evil. It's simply what you had to leave behind to fit in, to survive, to be loved. The dreams you abandoned, the instincts you ignored, the softness you hid. At 60, these things come back, not to haunt you, but to offer themselves again, this time without conditions. This is why some people suddenly want to study again, to learn a new skill, to travel not for adventure, but for awakening. They want to reclaim the life that got shelved for decades. It's common in this season to let go of toxic relationships, to set boundaries that once seemed impossible. Not because of anger, but because the soul now has no patience for what drains its energy. You stop apologizing for taking up space. You stop explaining your no. You stop dimming your light to make others comfortable. And this too is part of the curve. You finally give yourself permission to be fully seen by yourself first, and then perhaps by others. This rebirth doesn't need approval, doesn't crave applause. It only requires courage, the courage to be real, to stop pretending, to stop postponing your truth. And as you say yes to this process, you begin to notice something incredible. The soul, now unburdened, begins to shine. A new kind of beauty emerges. Not the kind that turns heads, but the kind that turns hearts. A quiet, steady, radiant beauty, rooted in authenticity. This kind of beauty can't be faked. It doesn't come from makeup, filters, or external approval. It comes from presence, from having walked through fire and chosen not to become ash, but light. It's the kind of beauty that unsettles those who are still trapped in the theater of image and ego. Because it doesn't seek attention, it simply radiates. And the ones who carry it often don't even realize they're glowing. They've spent so long adjusting themselves to fit others' expectations, they forgot they were meant to shine from the beginning. At this stage, if you listen closely, you may feel a deeper calling within. Perhaps you no longer recognize yourself in your old roles. Maybe there's a pull towards something more meaningful, a desire to simplify, to be selective with your energy. You begin to care less about being liked and more about being true. You say no without guilt and yes only when your heart agrees. This shift may feel foreign, even rebellious at times, but it's not selfish. It's sacred. It's the soul finally asking to be lived without compromise. The world may not understand this shift. Society often frames aging as decline, as fading. But Jung offered a different lens. He saw this phase as the richest of all. He believed that only when the ego releases its grip can the soul truly emerge. That's why many people feel more creative, more expressive, more inwardly alive in their 60s than ever before. The noise dies down, and in the silence, truth speaks louder. And yet, this phase isn't just about forward movement. It's also a return. Old memories bubble up. Childhood moments, forgotten dreams, relationships that left echoes. But this is not nostalgia. It's the soul organizing itself, revisiting the archives of your life, not to dwell, but to make peace. You begin to understand what still aches, what still seeks closure, what still matters. And this process invites stillness, reflection, forgiveness, not just of others, but of yourself. This kind of reflection doesn't require isolation. It shows up in everyday life, in a song that brings unexpected tears, in a place that holds old echoes, in a conversation that leaves you tender. These aren't breakdowns. They're breakthroughs. The soul is speaking in its native tongue, emotion, memory, sensation. And to truly hear it, you must be willing to pause, to listen. Not just with your ears, but with your entire being. You may find yourself craving simplicity. Not because life is over, but because you now understand what matters. You no longer chase experiences for the sake of accumulation. You choose them for resonance. A walk without a destination. A book that stirs something deep. A sunset that doesn't need to be photographed. These moments are no longer background. They become the sacred center. And in them, the soul finds rest. This rest isn't laziness. It's sacred stillness. It's a conscious choice to slow down and feel life fully, rather than rush through it. At 60, you begin to understand that presence is more valuable than productivity. The world may still push for performance, but the soul no longer participates in that race. It seeks depth. It seeks resonance. You begin to feel time differently, not as a countdown, but as a space to breathe, to reflect, to be. Love changes too. It stops being about filling gaps or meeting expectations. It becomes quieter, richer, and more honest. You no longer need love to complete you. You offer love to accompany, to witness, to nourish. You don't need dramatic declarations or grand gestures. Sometimes, love is a glance that says, "I see you." Sometimes, it's shared silence that feels more intimate than words. At this stage, love becomes a sanctuary, not a transaction. Fear, on the other hand, begins to loosen its grip. You've lived through too much to be scared of the small stuff. You've faced heartbreak, disappointment, uncertainty, and you're still here. That alone becomes a source of strength. You no longer fear being alone, because now solitude feels like companionship with your truest self. You no longer fear rejection, because you've learned that your worth isn't dependent on anyone's approval. You no longer fear starting over, because you've seen how resilient the soul truly is. There's a quiet confidence that emerges, not the kind that boasts, but the kind that knows. A confidence born not of achievements, but of endurance. You've been bruised and still chose love. You've been lost and still chose to hope. This kind of inner power cannot be taken away. It doesn't need to be explained. It's felt. At this point in life, your wisdom deepens. Not the kind you learned from books, but the kind carved by experience. It lives in your body. It colors your speech. It shapes your silence. You start offering fewer opinions and more presence. You no longer rush to fix everything. You simply sit with people, offering your undivided self as a gift. And that is more healing than advice ever could be. Creativity often awakens in this space. With less noise and more room for stillness, the soul starts to create, not for applause, but for expression. You may feel pulled to write, to paint, to garden, to make music, to cook, not to impress, but to feel alive. You begin to create not as an act of ambition, but as a ritual of joy. A way to say, "I am still here. I am still becoming." The most beautiful truth of this phase is that you no longer live for others. You begin to live from within. The soul finally gets a voice, and when it speaks, it doesn't shout. It whispers, and its whispers guide you home, to your true self, your deeper self, your enduring self. Home, in this sense, isn't a place. It's a state of being. It's the moment you stop needing to be anyone else. It's the space inside you that doesn't ask for permission to exist. You no longer chase after identity. You settle into essence. And that essence is simple, grounded, free. You stop editing yourself. You stop shrinking to fit into people's expectations. You start showing up in full, sometimes soft, sometimes fierce, always whole. This shift changes everything. Relationships evolve. Some fade away, not out of conflict, but because they no longer align with who you're becoming. Others deepen, often quietly. You're drawn to those who recognize you beyond the surface, who can sit with your silence without trying to fill it, who value your presence more than your performance. These connections become fewer, but richer. And in them, you find not only companionship, but resonance. Even your relationship with time transforms. You begin to feel time as a gift, not a threat. You no longer rush through your days, counting tasks. Instead, you begin to savor time, like warm tea, slow sunsets, long conversations, walks with no agenda. You stop living in the next thing, you start noticing the now. The weight of the moment becomes more important than its efficiency. There's a deep healing that begins in this space. Not from medicine, but from presence. From finally allowing yourself to stop performing, to breathe without expectation, to rest without guilt. It's in these moments of stillness that the pieces of your life begin to come together, not neatly, but truthfully. The stories, the scars, the struggles, all find their place. You begin to see your life not as a series of mistakes or triumphs, but as a single, evolving truth. Jung called this phase late individuation, a process where everything that was once fragmented slowly begins to reunite. The masculine and feminine, the adult and the inner child, the achiever and the dreamer, the shadow and the light. All of them finally meet, acknowledge one another, and begin to coexist. This isn't about becoming someone new. It's about finally becoming yourself, fully, fearlessly, with compassion. And it's not dramatic. There's no climax, no grand finale, just small, profound moments. The smell of a book that stirs an old dream, the sound of laughter in an empty room, a memory that no longer hurts, a tear that falls without shame. You begin to realize that these are not fragments. They're poetry, the poetry of a life deeply lived. This is why so many people feel the urge to simplify, to live with fewer things, fewer obligations, but with deeper purpose, to clean out not just closets, but beliefs, expectations, identities, to let go of what no longer feels true, not in bitterness, but in peace. Because at this stage, letting go doesn't feel like loss. It feels like making space. Space for breath, for beauty, for being. And in that space, something miraculous begins to grow. Not loudly, but steadily. A quiet wisdom emerges. Not because you've read more or achieved more, but because you've lived more. Because you've hurt, healed, forgiven, and begun again. This wisdom isn't about giving advice. It's about presence, about embodying what you've learned, not declaring it. It shows up in how gently you speak, how patiently you listen, how softly you hold the world. You no longer need to convince anyone of anything. You've learned that real truth doesn't need to be proven. It just is. You begin to feel the difference between noise and message, between reaction and response, between attention and connection. Your life becomes more selective, not out of fear, but because you finally know what nourishes you. You turn away from what drains you. You walk toward what feeds your soul. This stage of life isn't about fading. It's about deepening. It's not about being less visible, but more real. And that reality carries weight. Your presence begins to impact people not because of what you do, but because of who you are. Your children, your grandchildren, your friends, even strangers can feel it. They might not always understand it, but they sense it. A settledness, a clarity, a peace that's been earned. This is the legacy of soul work. Not fame, not perfection, but authenticity. The courage to be yourself, even when the world doesn't applaud, even when no one notices. Because you've stopped living for the world's validation and started living from your own center. At 60, many people begin to feel the soul's voice louder than ever. It doesn't speak in commands or doctrines. It speaks in whispers, in sensations, in longings that don't make logical sense, but feel undeniably real. You might feel drawn to a new practice, meditation, art, nature, travel. not to escape, but to experience, not to prove anything, but to return to something sacred within. The soul doesn't measure time in years. It measures depth. It asks, how deeply did you live? How honestly did you love? How bravely did you forgive? How gently did you carry yourself through the fire? And your answers to these questions become the quiet compass that guides your next steps. And in this sacred unfolding, something essential returns, not as a task, but as an offering. The permission to simply exist, to stop fixing, to stop striving, to rest, not as resignation, but as presence, to be with your life as it is. To stop asking, what's next? And begin asking, what's now? In this final stretch of reflection, something soft and true rises to the surface. A deep, unshakable appreciation for the ordinary. You no longer need grand moments to feel alive. A breeze on your skin, the scent of a familiar dish, the sound of birds at dawn. These become sacred. You start to realize that presence was always the real miracle. That showing up to your life, fully and without disguise, was the ultimate goal all along. You stop carrying the past like a weight. You start carrying it like a lesson. You no longer blame yourself for the versions of you that did what they had to in order to survive. Instead, you hold them with kindness. You forgive yourself, not to erase the past, but to finally walk freely into the future. And that future no longer demands that you become more. It invites you to become real, to root into who you already are. Because now you understand. Life was never about the image. It was about the essence, not about how far you went, but how true you remained. Carl Jung believed this late stage of life was sacred. That when the ego steps aside, the soul takes its rightful place, not above others, but within you. And when that happens, you no longer fear aging. You honor it. You no longer chase time. You walk with it. You no longer shrink. You expand quietly, peacefully, powerfully. And now, as this chapter begins, let it be one of truth. Let it be one where you don't hide, don't rush, don't apologize for who you are. Let it be the chapter where you finally breathe in your own rhythm and call it home. If this touched something inside you, like a whisper you've been waiting to hear, then maybe it's time. Time to like, share, or comment with the words your soul has longed to speak. And if you're ready to walk this path with us, subscribe to our channel, because your story still has so much more to say.